There is a photograph that tells you almost everything you need to understand about how this story was supposed to go. It was taken inside the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on May 14th, 2026. Donald Trump seated across from Xi Jinping, red carpeting stretching across polished floors, Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg positioned among the most powerful delegation of American corporate influence assembled in years. The message was unmistakable. America was about to close the biggest aviation deal in a decade, and everyone watching believed they already knew exactly how it would end. They were wrong. Because 8 days before that photograph was taken, in a place most American media had never bothered to find on a map, a different story had already begun. No cameras from major networks, no primetime coverage, no presidential motorcade, just a quiet hangar north of Montreal, a Malaysian airlines CEO being handed a Montreal Canadiens jersey and a signed agreement that instantly became the largest order of commercial aircraft in Canadian history. Two events, 8 days apart, two completely different visions of how economic power actually works in 2026. And almost nobody in Washington connected them. This is the story of how they should have been connected from the beginning. And once you see the full picture, Trump's Beijing celebration will never look quite the same way again. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you is not speculation. It is documented, verified, and far more deliberate than anyone in Washington wanted to admit. Let me start with what the world was watching. On May 14th, 2026, Donald Trump sat across from Xi Jinping in Beijing for the first time an American president had visited China since Trump's own trip there in 2017. 9 years. The world was watching because the stakes were enormous. Boeing had been, effectively frozen out of China since the catastrophic crashes of the 737 MAX, two deadly disasters that grounded the aircraft globally and triggered years of investigations into safety failures and corporate decision-making. What started as a technical problem became a geopolitical one fast. As tariffs and trade tensions exploded between Washington and Beijing, Boeing found itself trapped inside something far larger than airplane safety. The company was caught inside a full geopolitical Cold War. And while Boeing was frozen, Airbus moved. Quietly at first, then aggressively, then almost completely. By the time Trump landed in Beijing, industry insiders had been whispering numbers for months, 500 aircraft, maybe more. Bloomberg had reported Boeing was closing in on one of the largest sales in its history. Wall Street analysts modeled the recovery. Boeing stock had already jumped 4% just on the rumors. The expectation was no longer whether Trump would bring home a Boeing deal. The only question was how massive it would be. Then came the announcement on Fox News. One thing he agreed to today, he is going to order 200 jets, 200 big ones. And then, almost immediately, something nobody expected happened. Boeing stock did not rise. It fell, hard. Down 4.73% the same day, down another 1.38% overnight. Analysts at Jefferies had expected 500 to 600 aircraft. BNP Paribas analyst Matt Akers said publicly that investors were interpreting the announcement as less than hoped for. Fortune described the summit as heavy on ceremony, light on substance. Which type of Boeing plane was even ordered remained unclear for days. Trump, on his previous trip to China in 2017, had brought home 300 jets. This time, with the biggest diplomatic buildup in years, with Boeing's CEO in the room, with 500 planes priced into the market, Washington came back with 200. And the market called it a disappointment before the press conference was even over. But here is what almost no one in American media was saying at that exact moment. 8 days earlier, a Canadian prime minister had already signed a deal that made the Beijing announcement look even smaller than it already was. Before I show you exactly what happened in that hangar in Quebec, you need to understand who was standing in it. Because this is where most coverage makes its first mistake. It treats Mark Carney as a politician. He is not, at least not in the way most people mean that word. Mark Carney spent 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs. He holds a doctorate in economics from Oxford. He was appointed governor of the Bank of Canada and guided the country through the 2008 financial crisis with more institutional stability than almost any comparable economy in the world achieved during that period. He was then appointed governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history. This is a man who has sat in rooms where a single misread signal moved billions of dollars, who understands the difference between an announcement and an agreement, between political theater and industrial execution, between a number that looks big on television and a contract that actually changes production lines. When Carney stood in that Mirabel hangar on May 6, 2026, he was not making a political speech. He was executing a strategy that had been in motion since at least October 2025. And the details of that strategy reveal something about how economic power actually operates that Washington's approach to the Beijing summit completely missed. Here is what actually happened, and the sequencing matters more than anything else. In October 2025, Mark Carney traveled to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for the ASEAN summit. While there, he met privately with Tony Fernandez, the co-founder and CEO of AirAsia. They discussed deepening ties between Canada and Southeast Asia. They discussed the future of aviation in a world where American trade policy was becoming increasingly unpredictable. And they discussed what it would look like for one of Asia's largest low-cost airline networks to place its future aircraft orders not through an American lens, but through a Canadian one. That conversation happened 7 months before the Mirabel announcement, 7 months before Trump landed in Beijing. On May 6, 2026, 8 days before Trump's summit with Xi Jinping, Mark Carney walked into the Airbus Canada assembly facility in Mirabel, Quebec, 40 kilometers northwest of Montreal. Beside him stood Quebec Premier Christine Frechette, Airbus commercial aircraft chief Lars Wagner, and Tony Fernandez himself, who had flown in from Kuala Lumpur to sign. What they signed was not a letter of intent, not a framework agreement, not a political understanding waiting for paperwork that might never fully materialize. It was 150 firm orders for the Airbus A220-300, the largest single firm order in the entire history of the A220 program, the largest order for a Canadian designed and produced commercial aircraft ever recorded, valued at approximately $19 billion at list prices, every single aircraft to be assembled at Mirabel, not at Airbus's Alabama facility, Mirabel. The first delivery scheduled for the first quarter of 2028. AirAsia's CEO publicly stated he aimed to build the world's largest A220 fleet, and he left open the possibility of doubling the order if Airbus moves forward with a larger variant of the aircraft. Now pause and think about what those numbers mean compared to what Trump announced 8 days later. 200 Boeing jets, details unclear, aircraft type unspecified, timeline unspecified, delivery schedule unspecified, market reaction negative, stock fell nearly 5%. 150 Airbus A220s, firm orders, aircraft type specified, production location specified, delivery timeline specified, first delivery date specified, option for 150 more on the table. One deal arrived through a television interview, the other arrived through paperwork. One depended on political momentum, the other depended on industrial execution. One left Wall Street asking what type of jets were even ordered. The other left Mirabel workers knowing exactly when production would begin. Now let me show you why none of this was an accident. The aircraft at the center of the Mirabel deal is not just any airplane. The Airbus A220 is one of the most important industrial stories in Canadian history, and most people outside aerospace circles have never fully heard it. It began as the Bombardier C Series, a next-generation narrow-body jet designed to compete directly with Boeing and Airbus. Technically impressive, praised by pilots, loved by passengers. The problem was money. Building airplanes costs enormous amounts. Delays piled up, costs exploded. Bombardier nearly collapsed. Quebec stepped in with billions in support. It was not enough. In 2018, Airbus took over the program, rebranded it as the A220, and for years, many Canadians quietly feared they had lost something permanent. Because when multinationals take over struggling national programs, jobs disappear, production moves, factories shrink, promises quietly fade. For years, Mirabel faced exactly those fears. The A220 was still not profitable 8 years after Airbus took over. Production rates were running at roughly 7 to 8 aircraft per month, far below the 14 needed to break even. Then came May 6, 2026, and 150 firm orders pushed the A220 past 1,100 total orders globally. The program suddenly had the commercial gravity it had been searching for since Bombardier dreamed it into existence, and every one of those 150 aircraft would be assembled in Quebec by Canadian workers. The Mirabel facility currently employs over 4,600 people directly on the A220 program. Airbus supports more than 27,000 Canadian careers across its full aerospace supply chain. Over 850 Canadian suppliers, more than $2 billion in annual contracts to Canadian companies, and 2,500 of those Mirabel workers were hired in just the last 4 years. Let me bring this down to the level it actually matters, because the number 27,000 is not a statistic. It is a morning shift. It is a parking lot filling up in Mirabel before dawn. It is a machinist in Laval with a mortgage and 2 kids in school who now knows his plant has years of contracted work ahead of it. It is a logistics company in Saint-Jérôme whose survival depends on a stable supply chain that just got dramatically more stable. It is a welder who lived through the uncertainty of the Bombardier years, who watched the C-Series nearly disappear, who showed up every day not knowing whether the program would survive, and who on May 6, 2026, watched his Prime Minister stand in his facility and announce the largest aircraft order in Canadian history. That is what a real deal looks like at ground level. Not a television announcement, not a stock ticker reaction, not a press conference on Air Force One. The evidence of economic power, when it is real, does not need a broadcast. It shows up in the parking lot. And here is the dimension of this story that almost nobody in American coverage has connected properly. The customer is not Canadian, not American, not European. The customer is Malaysian, a Southeast Asian low-cost carrier serving one of the fastest growing aviation markets in the world. And that geography is everything. Because while Washington spent months focused on reopening Boeing's relationship with China, Carney was moving into something much broader, Southeast Asia, the next generation of global aviation growth. Middle classes expanding across Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, regional carriers scaling at rates that dwarf anything happening in mature Western markets. This is where the next billion-dollar airline passengers will come from. And Canada just signed a multi-decade relationship with one of the carriers positioned to serve them. Now let me give you 3 things that tell you exactly where this story goes from here. First, the production question. Airbus has committed to reaching 13 A220 aircraft per month by early 2028, up from the current 7 to 8. The AirAsia order creates the demand certainty that justifies that acceleration. If production reaches those targets, Mirabel moves toward profitability for the first time. If it does not, the order creates pressure on Airbus to solve its supplier and production bottleneck problems fast. Either way, Mirabel is no longer uncertain. It is the center of the story. Second, the doubling option. Tony Fernandez said publicly he would double the AirAsia order if Airbus moves forward with a stretched A220-500 variant. That decision is currently being analyzed inside Airbus. Airlines including Air France and American budget carrier Breeze Airways are already pushing for it. If Airbus approves the A220-500, another order of that scale from AirAsia becomes possible. And every additional aircraft means more years of Mirabel production, more supply chain stability, more Canadian aerospace jobs. The decision Airbus makes in the next 18 months about the A220-500 may matter more for Canadian aerospace employment than any government announcement. Third, the Boeing comparison over time. Trump's 200-jet deal with China comes with no delivery timeline, no aircraft type specification, and a history of Chinese aircraft commitments that have not always fully materialized. In 2017, Trump announced 300 Boeing jets from China. In the years that followed, Boeing received just 51 orders from China, mostly freighters. The market remembers that history. Mirabel does not have that problem. Its 150 aircraft have firm orders, a specified delivery schedule, and a CEO who flew to Quebec personally to sign. Now, here are 3 questions nobody has answered yet. And I want to be honest that these questions matter as much as anything I have told you. 1. The A220 program is still not profitable. Airbus Canada CEO Guillaume Chevasson said publicly at the Mirabel announcement that the program remains a few miles away from profitability. Quebec has already written off its initial $1 billion investment in the C-Series as valueless. At what production rate and what order volume does the A220 finally cross into sustained profitability, and does this order get it there fast enough? 2. If AirAsia doubles its order, as Fernandez suggested it could, where does Airbus build the additional aircraft? Mirabel or Alabama? That decision will tell you whether Quebec's aerospace advantage deepens or whether the growth gets distributed across facilities in ways that reduce the Canadian benefit. 3. Trump reserved the right for China to buy up to 750 Boeing jets as part of the Beijing framework. If that broader number ever materializes, how does it change the competitive landscape between Boeing and Airbus in Asian markets? And what does that mean for the A220 program that depends on Asian demand to drive its profitability journey? I do not have definitive answers to any of those 3 questions. Neither does anyone else yet. But here is what I do know, and it is the thing I want you to carry with you when you close this video. 8 days separated 2 announcements. One arrived through a Fox News interview, one arrived through a factory floor in Quebec. One left Wall Street asking what type of jets were even ordered. One left 4,600 Mirabel workers knowing exactly when their production lines would accelerate. Remember that photograph inside the Great Hall of the People? Trump, Xi, Boeing CEO in the room. The most concentrated delegation of American corporate influence in years. All of it designed to produce one historic aviation announcement. By the time that photograph was taken, Carney had already been to Kuala Lumpur, already met with Tony Fernandez, already positioned Canada inside Southeast Asia's aviation future, and already signed an agreement sitting in that hangar waiting for the world to notice. Washington was building for a headline. Canada was building for decades. That is the difference between a deal and a strategy. And the market knew which one it was looking at the moment the numbers came out. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because the story of who actually controls the future of North American economic power is not over. It is not close to over. And the next chapter is already being written in places most American media will spend 90 seconds on before moving to something louder. Do not be the last one to know.